One of the things we've been trying to do for the last few months on the show is sort through all of the geopolitical complexities of the Trump administration. And there's no better person to talk to than Sarah Adams, a former CIA analyst and one of the sharpest investigators and analysts in the business. And so, Sarah, as you are using your skill set that you honed over many years to look at the Iran war, what are the particular things you're looking at to try to make sense of what's happening and, from my perspective, why we're doing it?
Yeah, I mean, the current part of what's happening is, of course, we had the 60 days to put this ceasefire deal into place. It obviously has gone haywire. And now, really, I mean, the deal's pretty much up in smoke. We also had these escalations by Iran, of course, attacking Jordan once where we had casualties, and now again yesterday where we were luckily able to stop it. And then, of course, attacking in Egypt. So the unfortunate thing is everybody thought in these 60 days, hey, we're going to de-escalate, and then everybody's going to sit down, come to some sort of a deal, and we would move on from it. Now with these escalations, it's very unclear, how long this is going to be prolonged, and then what are, the key things we're looking for as we move forward, since we don't seem to be at the negotiating table.
Sarah, I hope maybe for the sake of our audience, actually for me personally too, we could just take a little bit of a step back and look at this whole situation from the perspective of why we're there in the first place. And this is a question Chris and I have tried to get to the bottom of. We understand in the abstract, okay, Iran is an enemy. They don't like us. We don't like them. And I hope, though, maybe from an intelligence perspective, you can give us a little bit more clarity on what Iran exactly is up to. Why are they a threat now? I think there's a lot of skepticism out there from, even the MAGA audience that this is a war or military engagement worth going into for us. And so help make the case, if you can, if you're willing, for why Iran is such a threat. What are they up to geopolitically that is such a thorn in our side that it justifies this kind of action?
Sure, I'll move away from the long historic reason why Iran is a threat and just get to last year when we decided to take the strikes on the nuclear program because we believed it was farther along than originally assessed. So we did the strikes. What seems to have happened come the beginning of this year, two pieces. One was, hey, we did not make enough damage to that program that we thought. Like one of the facilities, we didn't even damage any of the centrifuges, and then somehow they got moved out. I don't even know how we missed that, but that happened. And then another thing came up to where, we haven't really dealt with this issue with how many missiles they have. So it seems when we went in this time, this year, a lot of the focus was on kind of these missile stockpiles, missile production, etc. Well, it came out, in the last day or two, we thought we did better against it. We didn't. They still have about 20 to 25% of that stockpile. So there's now this discussion, should we put in like a 10 to 14 day bombing campaign and solely focus on the missiles? Because again, they're using them against US interests. They're going farther and farther with them. They're getting more aggressive. They're bombing a ton of energy infrastructure. So now we're kind of focused on the missile piece. So it started nuclear. We didn't do well enough potentially on nuclear, went back, focused missiles. And so it's a little unclear now where it all stands, but I don't think we have good insights even now into the nuclear piece. So we'll still have to circle back to that.
This seems though like there's my concern the whole time has always been, if that's the goal, if they're not allowed to have nuclear weapons, which is, of course, a laudable goal. The world would be better if Iran didn't have nuclear weapons, but now also shifting to they shouldn't have any kind of conventional missile arsenal. That just seems like a recipe for a permanent engagement along the same lines. And is this feasible? Is it feasible to just keep engaging in these airstrikes until they run out of weapons? Or is this what I think a lot of people fear, a recipe for getting engaged in a kind of interminable campaign, a campaign with no endpoint, no victory conditions, and no possibility of disengagement?
Yeah, I mean, it could go both ways. The best solution is let's see what we can get done in a short period of time, destroy as many as possible, get the deal in place, and move on if this is our objective, right? Because, of course, early on, people were like, oh, is it regime change? Well, we haven't done any sort of bombing campaign to show we have any interest in regime change. So I'm just pretending that's off the table because I haven't visually seen that. So that is the best case forward now because of where we are. Yes, if you went after every stockpile, I mean, there's going to be resupplies, right? China's going to maybe help resupply them, et cetera. There's black market resupplies. So you can't just say we're going to stop a missile program forever or a drone program in Iran. I mean, that's not plausible, but I don't hate the idea of let's at least destroy the rest of the stockpiles we know of.
All right, so I want to even ask like a more fundamental question here, which is help the audience like better understand the threat assessment, because if I'm like, what I hear from people is like, all right, so there's this thing Hezbollah, they fund a lot of bad people, but it's like in Yemen or it's in Lebanon, it's quarantined within this particular geographic zone that really doesn't touch us in the United States. Yes, maybe it touches our allies, and it's a nuisance for our geopolitical interests, but it's not as existential for us. And maybe it's just not worth it. Like maybe it's not worth going into Iran and trying to dismantle this government that is funding these regional terrorist activities. Is that a fair assessment, or should Americans be worried about this, worried about it touching their lives in a more concrete way?
Yeah, I mean, long term, of course, we've always been at war with this Iranian regime, and what they do is use those proxies that you mentioned and target our troops. Of course, they killed a lot of troops in Iraq, and they will always continue to do that. Now, people say, well, if we didn't have troops there, they wouldn't target us. That's not exactly the case, right? They want the end of Israel, the end of US, and that's not actually changing. So the current regime as it stands will never stop targeting us. So if we do move out of the region or somewhere else, they'll use proxies and target us there, right? They used, obviously, you brought up Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. Now, a lot of people say, well, nothing's happening on U.S. soil. That's not exactly the truth. There are a lot of Hezbollah members on U.S. soil. There's Hamas members. But for many years, they've been focusing on like the fundraising, business side of those operations, and they haven't really done anything active. The threat on U.S. soil is mostly from kind of their Department 400 in the IRGC and 840. They do external operations and they focus on targeted assassinations. So an everyday American isn't worried, I'm going to be assassinated, but you do have the president, the Secretary of State, Secretary of War, prior military leaders in CENTCOM who are under this active threat. And IRGC does have surveillance teams on them. So I don't think Americans understand that you could be living in a neighborhood and there are IRGC operatives doing surveillance in your neighborhood because it's so hard to wrap your mind around. So they are in US soil. They have a different focus than like somebody like Al Qaeda who wants to do a massive attack, but they do have targets, and they're not just targeting Americans, they're targeting kind of Iranian dissidents as well, both in US and Canada.
Can I just ask you, like, on that question, okay, there are these IRGC agents or sleeper cells or something in America. I don't doubt that may in fact be true, but do we have like concrete evidence that that's the case, that, that this isn't just like fear mongering? These people are here, we've caught some of them. We understand their operations. We know what they're up to. Do we have like concrete evidence about this?
Yeah, we know they've been coming for years. A lot of them actually came through Venezuela. That was a big problem. They came on Venezuela documents. I want to say, gosh, it's maybe almost 2 years ago, FBI actually did release the identity of one of them and said he's actually, technically an assassin on U.S. soil. They rarely release them, which is interesting. But there's different pockets, as you can imagine, but a lot of it is focused around the president and his wife. So there's teams like in New York, down in Florida, in DC, etc. So it's not like there's a cell of them in every state, for example, but they are focused on, some of these key individuals that they've long been targeting.
So it's an interesting question, though. If you have, in theory, highly trained Iranian military intelligence operatives that have state resources, and yet it doesn't seem like they've tried to execute any of these plots. And frankly, what we've seen over the last 2 years is that it's not actually that difficult. You had Thomas Crook, some kid. You had the Charlie Kirk assassination, obviously not a Secret Service detail, and you had the Ukraine fundraising guy at the golf course. If they're here, if they want to assassinate the president or high-level officials, why do you think they haven't put any of these operations into effect? If we're already assassinating their leadership, in some sense, all bets are off. Do they have anything to lose? And if not, what's preventing them?
Well, the first part that you said, highly trained, kind of take that off the table.
Okay.
So the way Iran does the targeting is crazy. So there is one, I'd say, plot against Trump that I would call highly trained and be concerned of. And that one hasn't been said to go yet. It's like a suicide bomber plot. But for the most part, Iran really does recruit people and they say, try to make this happen. And that's what we had that weird Asif merchant guy arrested, the Pakistani. That guy is actually the majority of the plotting, like a guy like him. So they don't lots of times send high-ranking senior operatives to U.S. They recruit people who are here, who have access, and then they kind of just pay them and say, do what you can do. So it's a really interesting thing. They don't do a good job. I mean, years ago, they tried assassinating like the Saudi ambassador in DC. It's same mess, right? So the interesting thing is they don't really send their A-team here. Now, it's not that they're not here. I still think there are different pieces of the plot that do have better people. But it's complicated, as you can imagine, because yes, we did have these shots of the president, but that doesn't mean it's super easy. And we do have to keep that in mind. There were some security failures in those cases, but it isn't actually that easy to, take a shot at the president of the United States.
And how much of this coming from Iran is just sort of secular, geopolitical, adversarial interest versus the religious component? Because I think, most of us are conditioned to think about Middle Eastern terrorism and these sorts of things as being motivated by religious, specifically Islamic interests. Is that the case here with Iran and these agents? Or is this really just about, Iran here could be interchangeable with North Korea from a religious perspective? This is really just about some kind of, again, secular, geopolitical conflict, that this is how they resolve it. And then also, as a sidebar to that, does Russia and China fit into this picture anywhere? And if so, where?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to put it, it is based on religion, is Islamist. Iran is on the same page as a lot of the terrorist groups that they believe in the idea of bringing the Caliphate back. That's their marching orders. Even the new Ayatollah, he starts his new phrases, if he's even alive, with Imam Mahdi. He ends it with Imam Mahdi, right? They want this Islamic army back. So that is 100% their base. Now, we have to remember a lot of anything in politics, even from a terrorist regime, is also propaganda, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of threats and stuff they put out there is propaganda. It's to cause fear, etc. So there are kind of two pieces to the coin. There is kind of these operational concerns. And then with anything, there is information operation and those type of things. And sometimes we conflate the two. And so you see a bunch of Iranian threats. Well, maybe 90% of those aren't in any way operational.
So my question for you, and I'm very curious to hear your take, a big internal division on the right within the Trump administration even is about why we're doing this. And so there was very, very famously Joe Kent, who was formerly a congressional candidate here in Washington State, resigns his position as the counterterrorism center director. And in his letter, he says, we've engaged in this Iran war on Israel's sake. The president is being manipulated, and he resigns to try to draw attention to this. Do you give any weight to those accusations? And in your experience, what is the relationship between the two intelligence services, the U.S. intelligence services and the Israeli intelligence services?
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of Americans have been at war for 20 years. So I think there's a lot of people hesitant. Let's not get pulled into something. So, I feel all opinions should come to the table. I do believe this current conflict started October 7th. So Iran and Hamas pulled us into it, right? They killed over 30 Americans at the time, and it hasn't been finished yet. So that's crisis is still ongoing, and we just have to be honest about that.
Kent's resignation about Israel, and I'm just curious, in your experience, the relationship between the two intelligence services, because some have argued that that essentially we're fighting a war for Israel. The president's being manipulated by Israel. And I'm just curious to get actual facts, because it's easy to make these accusations, but what does it look like on the ground for people who work in the business?
The best way to explain it is, depending on the country, you have key partners who have better intelligence than others, right? So maybe in Afghanistan, the Canadians were probably a really good partner, in the Brits. They had a lot of good intelligence. Now, when we're talking in Iran, Lebanon, Mossad is a great partner there because that's where they have their best intelligence. Now, if we're talking North Africa, it's probably the French. So it always depends on the region. So yes, if we're talking Iran, Mossad is pretty much the best partner there because they have the best intelligence, but they have crappy intelligence, in 98% of the rest of the world. But I think people kind of lose sight of that because they're all wrapped up, in this current conflict. So they're useful for like a portion of the world's threats, let's say 5 to 10%, not for the rest of it. And so I think that's something that gets lost. I also just think there's a lot of propaganda around what's going on, a lot of misinformation. People aren't being told the truth. So they think Israel is pulling all these strings. Now, if we just look at straight numbers, right? If we look at how much Israel, their lobby puts into, let's say, our Congress, vice like a Muslim Brotherhood lobby, it's like pennies on the dollar to the Muslim Brotherhood. So there are forces who have more opinions and influence in our government, but at the end of the day, I don't think anyone tells our president what to do. It would be very difficult to convince me of that.
And how does curious about what you said, quick follow-up on the Muslim Brotherhood. Explain what you mean. The Muslim Brotherhood is engaging in influence operations, lobbying. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing everybody says Israel does, but the one who's actually doing effectively is the Muslim Brotherhood. They're putting a lot more money into it. So they do a host of things. They back a lot of the political candidates financially. As we know, they pump a ton of money into our universities. But they also are very much like the Chinese, and nobody's really honest about that. They start at the local level. They get involved in community organizations and chambers of commerce, religious organizations, volunteer organizations. So they're more integrated than I think most people realize. I think they're starting to see it now with some of these DSA candidates because they're like, strange. Some of the money's coming from Muslim Brotherhood elements, but they're not realizing this has been built up for decades now, and we're just seeing the fruits of their labor.
Wow. Yeah, look, we have a candidate up in Michigan right now, Saeed, who I've recently read reports, and admittedly, these are just like headlines that, he may be funded by Muslim Brotherhood. This comes as a surprise to me, but it sounds like you're saying, no, this is something to be expected. These organizations have been working at the municipal level for a long time. And I guess I wonder then, again, it's like if you're of a certain age, you're conditioned to think about influence from the Muslim world, quote unquote, as the threat is like active terrorism, but it may have evolved since then. And we may be fighting a threat that is no longer active. And there are new things now that we need to be paying attention to. So Can you just kind of walk us through the mechanics of how this new kind of evolution of this threat is manifesting in Americans' day-to-day lives, what that looks like on the ground in places like Michigan or elsewhere? What are the signs? And by the way, what are they trying to achieve? Like, what are the goals here?
Yeah, so the Muslim Brotherhood is now almost 100 years old. They're like 98 or 99 years old. So they have done this since their inception. As you can imagine, though, when it first kicked off and when they are the most powerful, they really try to do it in places like Egypt and then Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, UAE came out of nowhere and became an economic powerhouse, and they started there. They were working in Jordan. Well, those countries were like, whoa, 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 whoa. They saw the impacts, the influence, because really what Muslim Brotherhood does, or the political action arm to then bring in kind of extremists, politicians, and politics. They want you to kind of not view terrorism for what it is, right? It's freedom fighters. So it's all getting your brain to shift. So in those countries, they said, we can't risk this, and they completely banned it. So it's been happening, but we're so far behind the curve that we're not even doing what the Muslim countries is doing, which is crazy, because we should be following their lead on this as the experts. Now, when it comes to the US, though, it's so complicated, because when we say Muslim Brotherhood, you're not going to drive down the street and have a building and it says the Muslim Brotherhood. It's going to be called something like, I don't know, the Saudi American Friendship Society, right? It'll have all those weird naming conventions, actually like Scientology does. That's a really good example when you drive by their buildings. So it's like you don't actually know at face value it's a Muslim Brotherhood unless you really follow the money and do the dig deep in. And so that's where it's complicated, because people at the local level don't even know that they're interacting. They don't know in a lot of cases, some of these activists, the local candidates, maybe even who's running their Chamber of Commerce is Muslim Brotherhood. That awareness does not exist at all in the United States. So we almost have to start from ground zero, explain this threat, show where they've made great advancements. They made a lot of advancements in Switzerland, obviously Scandinavia, France, and show, hey, here's what they're doing, and here now is how it's happening in the US. But it's been happening. It's just we're blind to it in some way.
What are their political goals? Like, what are they trying to accomplish?
Well, in my opinion, people will argue with me, but in my opinion, they are just the political arm of the terrorist and Islamist goal to reestablish the Caliphate. That sounds like a historical goal, but if we just go back to the last one, it's just essentially a reestablishment of something like the Ottoman Empire. And they really do believe it's possible. I mean, it was in existence in our grandparents' generation, so this isn't a 1,000-year thing.
Okay, so I want to pull back here, because what you're saying to me, it rings true. I've done some reporting on some of the care organizations, some of the kind of Mamdani movement that is combining democratic socialism with more kind of ideological Islamism. But if we step back, the question that I have is like, why are we allowing this to happen? Why do we allow Iranian affiliated terror groups, sleeper cells, radical Islamists? Why don't we just say they got to go home, get rid of these people? Why are we even in this position in the first place?
Well, there's multiple issues. One, we have like a divided country, right? So if you're in power, you can work that cleavage, and then every 2 to 4 years, our government changes and the other side works the cleavage. And so that helps the adversaries. Another thing is Americans are feeling and being harmed, by the economy. Things are costing too much money. Well, these different movements have long, the Muslim Brotherhood or the socialists saying, hey, we got solutions for that. We can fix this. And sometimes people want, like, maybe the radical change is what we need. So they are saying things that do resonate and sell. Now, the last piece, how they got in our country, of course, one thing is we had the open border policy, but for the other pieces, we really let in a bunch of people who don't even like America into this country. And, our vetting has completely failed. We lend family members of terrorists, et cetera. And that was a chosen response, right? Like we didn't have to allow that, and we did. So now we're on like a 30-year problem to solve this. And I don't think we're moving fast enough and hard enough to deal with that. So we do have a long battle going forward.
Sarah, I mean, I hate to put the blame on, you and your colleagues, certainly not you personally, but it's like, is this a failure of our intelligence community to properly assess this threat? I mean, realistically, 9/11 happens. And even before that, we don't have to point at 9/11. It's not like we didn't know this was a threat for a long time before that. And to say to ourselves, look, this is an area of the world where we just can't allow people en masse to come here, because the odds are that in that pool of people, there's just too many bad apples that are likely to take on this ideology that will inevitably lead to some kind of terrorist attack. We just know that. The numbers are there. Let me just ask you, did the intelligence community miss this? Did they make a miscalculation about our ability to assimilate these people? Was that the problem? Or was this a case where the intelligence community understood the threat, but were in tension with politicians who nonetheless, for whatever reasons they had, decided it was wise to go forward with this?
The interesting thing is our intelligence community has different pieces, right? Some focus internationally, some focus domestic. So we have the domestic piece of this, and they, as you know, go by political prioritization. So every 2 to 4 years, they say, oh, the focus is left wing, the focus is right wing, the focus is Islamist, whatever the political leaning is, which is a huge problem. We can't stay prioritized long term on something, which is, it makes a long term threat hard to find. Another thing a lot of people don't understand is it's not the intelligence community who are essentially vetting these people, right? They come through State Department, DHS. And so I think everybody's like, oh, well, every person who came into the country, like the CIA ran them by the database. That is not what's happening. And so we do have to be honest about that. We have to maybe change up our system in how we look at internal threats. Because obviously, if we talk about terrorists in U.S. soil, it's FBI. Well, FBI, they focus on things like entrapment operations. They aren't like infiltrating terrorist cells. So they don't have the skills. It's CIA does, but they don't work on the U.S. homeland. So we already have a problem there. Then after 9/11, we created like the DNI, NCTC. NCTC is an analytic organization. They write reports, they keep the database, but they don't have an operational arm. So when you start actually laying it out and you're like, who is responsible for this? Everybody says it's someone else's job, because it's not actually clear who is responsible. And that's unfortunately how our government's set up, right? We can always pass the buck. So we actually, I think, need to reorganize against this threat to deal with it well, because we have failed.
So tell me a little bit more about the presence of sleeper cells in the United States. And in particular, my question actually has always been this. It's a kind of terrorist cell, doesn't seem to require a lot of money, a lot of capacity. And in some ways, I'm actually surprised that it doesn't happen more often, given the fact that what we see in Europe, it seems to be happening more frequently. Like, what is the threat in the United States? Are we doing a good job at preventing these activities, or have we just been lucky that they haven't been operationalized at a faster tempo?
Yeah, so there's sleeper cells here. I don't love the term because it makes people think someone's sitting around waiting for like a bat signal. Most of the, I'd say, high-end sleeper cells here are doing something, right? They have a job that's surveillance. They might be doing some sort of bomb making, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the issue comes when it's a real plot, because most of the threats, especially in Europe and then a few here, have been someone inspired. And so when they're inspired, they go on, they want to do an attack. And it doesn't, as you know, come off very well because they're not trained. They're not really getting guidance from the mothership. And those are good, right? Those are the ones we want because they're not that effective. The fear is the actual real sleepers, right, belonging to Al-Qaeda and real ISIS, right? Like being trained in Syria or Iraq, that ISIS, not a guy who went online and tried to get on a forum. And those are the ones I think we need to be the most concerned of. And the problem is when they're in the United States, they're here under a different identity, right? And we first are having a hard time finding them, right? We don't know what identity they're under, but second, they're not committing crimes. So it's really hard in our legal system to charge someone you think is going to commit an attack, right? We don't have a system that works that way. And as you've seen, the deportations has been a nightmare. We can't even get kind of extremist college students out of this country, let alone the actual terrorists. So I think we're failing, and I think we have to find another way to do this. For many years, we had laws in the books. We have material support to terrorism laws. We can charge you if you only just joined a terrorist group. I think we need to lean back in and use those laws, especially to go against kind of the illegals here, because we do have a lot of terrorists on U.S. soil. And if we don't start moving quickly against them, it's going to embolden them. And that's a very dangerous thing.
I just want to like pause at the absurdity of the idea that we have like illegal aliens in this country who belong to like known terrorist organizations. And we have to do this complex like manipulation of the legal code in order to act on this. I mean, it's honestly like totally insane. And, maybe
black
okay, last week I got in some trouble
with.
for saying the revolution's over. Okay, maybe no, we need to like take some more radical action. Like that's crazy. That's really, it's like sad to me that that's the state of affairs, and that we have trouble doing this because of the lack of political will, or because our political adversaries, people on the left, can somehow manipulate these procedures to make it nearly impossible to act on these known threats. I mean, it's just totally absurd. But actually, let me ask you this question then. Why does the left seem to feel suddenly very comfortable in this arrangement that's kind of unstated, but it's there, where they are sort of actively engaging with this sort of Islamist threat? And I'll just use one example here, which is, Zohran Mamdani, if I get the details wrong, you can correct me, took a picture, had like a photo opportunity, and seemed very chummy with a guy who was the character witness for the Blind Sheikh at one point, okay? And of course, on the right, people go, why is the mayor of New York taking a photo op with a guy who's, defending the Blind Sheikh? And to the left, though, this is all just whatever. This is part of their ordinary politics now. We talked about Saeed in Michigan, who's running for Senate there. His dad is, has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, or a Muslim Brotherhood cutout, as you know. And this just seems to like not raise the kind of red flags on the left that it does on the right. So what's going on? Why has the left found itself so comfortable embracing
these aren't even scandals?
Politics?
It's not left or right. These aren't even scandals.
They're not. People don't seem to care.
And even on the right, yes, it's like the pro forma opposition, but it's not the kind of scandal that it would have been 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
All right, so there's two possibilities.
We've kind of fallen asleep on this stuff.
Right, so there's two possibilities. One is it's actually not that big of a deal. And here we are kind of overreacting to what are just kind of these incidental, 2 degrees of separation overlap between, prominent politicians and these seedy figures who actually never did anything wrong, but were adjacent to people who have done stuff that are wrong. That's one option. The other option is, yes, we're asleep at the switch and we're totally ignorant and almost willfully naive about this impending threat. So, I mean, Sarah, I can guess what your answer to that might be, but which one of these is closer to reality in your view?
Well, to talk about why it doesn't get dealt with is essentially campaign finance. So nobody wants to solve or put restrictions on campaign finance because there's a ton of corruption around it. It brings in a lot of money. And that is one of the key pieces where Muslim Brotherhood comes in. They come and fund campaigns. Now, yes, they mostly fund the left side, but there's plenty of Muslim Brotherhood going into the right. We have a lot of pro-Islamist people on the right too, unfortunately, because they're making those inroads, right? Yes.
Who are they? Can you give me some examples?
Yeah, let's name names.
I'm shocked by this.
Let's name names. Well, first off, of course, our special envoy to Turkey and Syria, Tom Barack, is definitely an Islamist, and a huge issue. A lot of the people around things like the Doha deal, like Khalid Zalmay, right? He's a representative for the U.S. government to the Taliban. He's, of course, an Islamist. So we have like these little pockets. We have a lot of people, even just on the working level across DHS, et cetera, that over time have moved up. And nobody's really been honest about them because you get that term, oh, you're an it's Islamophobia to say something, but we do have people pushing real Islamist agendas in our government, and we're not really truthful about it, and we're not really doing anything about it. And we have to be honest, it is happening on both sides of the aisle, and nobody's really taking the time to step back and see the coordination of these efforts.
So are you saying that they are Islamist by conviction, meaning that they kind of secretly share these goals? Or are you saying that they're merely compromised by, for example, economic interests from Gulf countries or other parts of the Middle East?
Yeah, they're not secretive. I mean, they are Islamist, and a lot of it is greed, the economic piece of it. Zalmay got rich off of all these deals in Afghanistan, trying to usher the Taliban back into power. People working Syria are going to make a lot of money when we pull back all the sanctions. There's going to be billions and billions of dollars on the table. So a lot of money to pull from there. And it's kind of going to be a cash cow. It was the cash cow they all hoped after Gaddafi fell. And a lot of it fell through, even though a lot of Americans did kind of pull out a lot of money from Libya. But sadly, we do have a lot of bad people in our government who plan to make money off of these geopolitical shifts. And we have to be honest about it. We do have corrupt people in our government.
I mean, I almost take that as a given. That's just like the nature of politics. And while we may not like it, it kind of is what it is, and sort of has always been thus. The thing I'm actually like more interested in, though, are people outside of our politics, and at least in a formal capacity. There's been a lot of speculation about information operations, okay, like media campaigns that are being funded by Islamist organizations, and people throw around these accusations. Okay, is Tucker taking money from whoever? Are these institutes like the Quincy Institute is taking money from Qatar? Qatar's funding all sorts of stuff. Does that necessarily, in your view, suggest something? And if so, what? I mean, how should we be thinking? How should the average viewer out there who's trying to make sense of our media landscape and the way that these different sort of strains of rhetoric have started to emerge on the right, whether it's anti-Israel stuff or not just anti-Israel, but pro-Islamist stuff, how should we be making sense of that? Is that an information operation? Is that being paid for? I mean, we can speculate. Can we say anything more than just speculation, though?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should look at it a little broader. All countries do some sort of influence operations. Some are more concerning, the Chinese ones, the Russian ones, the Muslim Brotherhood. For some people, it's the Israeli lobby, etc. Everyone funds information operations. Everyone funds lobbyists, right? So at the end of the day, that's something that's long occurred. It is a huge problem because it affects things. It affects the way people view things. It changes the way we think. It affects how a news article is written, right? It has influence in it, so you look at it a different way and think a different way. So that's very difficult to deal with because it's proving it, explaining it, and then even after the fact, convincing someone they were fooled. That's so complicated. Now, I think it's gotten a little out of proportion where every comment you make on social media, they're like, oh, you're an agent for somebody, right? I'm an agent for everybody. I'm an agent for ISIS. I'm an agent for ISI. I'm an agent. Oh, I'm a Mossad agent all the time. I mean, I'm all over the place. I was an Indian Raw agent. I mean, it's the craziest thing. I oddly never get cutter. But anyway, it's like that's someone's immediate response to you. And I think that's getting old. It's like learn how to have a real discussion and a real debate and stop with that crap. Like if you're really being influenced by a foreign government, the problem is you, is my opinion.
Okay, but it does seem like we're awash with all of this material where people have their various interests. There are economic players. A lot of money is changing hands in high places, and bombs are dropping. And yet, all of this, I think, is obscured for most people, including people who are relatively plugged in. And I guess it just raises the question: like, the Trump administration came into office with the promise of no new wars, and yet here we are. The promise to kind of declassify or reveal all of these various intelligence operations or kind of malfeasance within the intelligence community. And am I right in feeling, at least from my observation, that in fact, none of these things are true. And in fact, things are worse than they were before. It seems like it's more difficult to discern what is happening and to understand people's motives than it was in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. First off, the unfortunate thing is politicians make a lot of promises. They deliver on very small percentages of it. And we have to be truthful and honest about that. It happens, unfortunately, every election cycle. Another thing is there is like so much noise, right? We're constantly on our devices, right? You get that alert on your phone, like how many hours you were on it. Like it's insane how much we're consuming. So I don't even know if there's more influence now. I think we see it, or at least people are talking about it all the time, so we're thinking about it more. If you actually kind of cut the cord and got away from things, you wouldn't be influenced at all. Actually, like a month ago, I went to lunch with a friend. She does no social media. And it was fascinating to talk to her about the world because she was very informed, but she didn't know any of the crazy stuff. So I was telling her all the crazy stuff, the conspiracies online. She's like, what? It was interesting to see the perspective, right? Because it's like, wow, this is like a normal person who consumes information the way we did maybe 5 years ago. So I think there is...
You're making me nostalgic. I'm feeling nostalgic.
I know. Yeah. I miss it too. But
and there's people
who... It's not just foreign adversaries. There's people who will just give you misinformation because they make money off of it, right? They get followers and influence, so we have come up with a very broken system. You can't just go out and get like real truths and facts anymore. You have to go through so much garbage and so much noise to even like whittle out, well, what is actually true? What is the fact? There's so much propaganda. It's a very frustrating thing.
All right, let me ask though, the critique that Trump raised and MAGA has raised repeatedly about the intelligence agencies is it's this almost independent sort of quote unquote deep state operation that is not acting in the interests of the American people, that it is defiant of the elected government, at least the Trump government, certainly. And that it's basically gone rogue. It's operating according to its own agenda. Did you find in your time there that there's any legitimacy to these critiques about the intelligence agencies, and also that it's basically ineffective at what it was doing, and or like with ISIS or that wave of jihadism that we saw during like the 2010s, that itself was a consequence of perhaps even in some sense intentional, deep state operations, intelligence operations to create the very threat that they exist to manage. So did you see any of that? Do you have similar critiques of our intelligence agencies, or do you think all of that is basically a misunderstanding of how the CIA works?
I think it's the CIA just does their job. They do an excellent job. You brought up a good example, and this is the problem. So there's a thing called politicalization of intelligence. So when a new leader comes in, they put their kind of favorite people at the top of these organizations, and then it's those people who cause the issues, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, we know a lot of the names, Brennan, Clapper, et cetera, over time. So it's those individuals who have then, as you can imagine, relationships that endure over time in the intelligence community. And that's when you get this theory and ideas of a deep state. But the bigger issue is it's the politicalization of intelligence. So when you bring up that time period, so that's when ISIS was starting to get a foothold, right? The head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq created ISIS. ISIS starts getting a foothold. And then President Obama said, no, they're the JV squad. I don't want to hear anything about them. So CENTCOM started changing their analysis to downplay ISIS, and ISIS got huge. And they did that to appease the president. And unfortunately, that's happening all over the intelligence community, and it happens under each administration, and it just leans towards what they want, right? So I bet there's a lot of maybe exaggeration right now over left-wing terrorism. Up 2 years ago, there was a lot of exaggeration over right-wing terrorism because that's what the politicians want to hear. That's the mail they're answering, and that's not supposed to occur. So we were told that would change, and then that was going to be one of Tulsi Gabbard's big pushes. But then she had this focus. You got to go back to all these old investigations, all this old information. You got to declassify it. And she spent so much time declassifying all the old stuff. We actually haven't worked on anything going forward. So it's a little frustrating to watch it not be fixed. And we know now it's a problem 2 years from now, 4 years from now, the next 4 years from now. So until we fix the politicalization of intelligence and these politicians inputting and controlling the intelligence, we have a problem. Remember, CIA can't really do anything without the National Security Council. So the National Security Council is where you got to clean up, right, and have the right people leading it and the ethical people leading it. And nobody actually talks about that. They're the ones who really approve our intelligence operations.
Okay, great. Okay, and final question.
Oh, no, I have one more after this.
All right, penultimate question.
Yes,
what are you most worried about? Like, what keeps you up at night? What keeps you anxious? What are you most worried about as you think about all these issues?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, most things in DC don't affect us. Most things in the world don't affect us, but what we care about, right, is what happens in our community. So the biggest thing I worry about is these 20 million plus unknown people we brought in, we didn't vet. And I don't care if they're a terrorist. I don't care if they're a human trafficker. I don't care if they're a drug dealer, whatever. They're in our communities. And that's what makes me the most worried.
Okay, Sarah, Epstein, okay? You're in the intelligence agency, okay? You know, all the online speculation, we get the file drops. There are these, you know, elaborate stories about what he was up to and these sort of vague insinuations about his connections to Mossad, and there's blackmail operations, and you know, I think probably the general story there, so I don't need to recapitulate it for you. Does any of that hold water to you, okay, in your experience, whether you have firsthand knowledge about this or not? But is the Epstein thing real, or can we just put that to bed? What say you?
So I don't think Epstein was like an intelligence asset or a spy for a foreign government. I think he was one of these rich people. He had a lot of influence, a lot of friends in very senior roles. So that's where his influence piece comes in. Now, I do believe, obviously, he did commit these crimes, you know, against children. You know, there's a lot of harm done. There's a lot of victims. And I do think we sometimes focus on the wrong piece, right? Instead of focusing on them and bringing justice for them, you know, we focus on kind of these conspiracies and theories. Now, at the end of the day, the biggest issue is Acosta made the deal back, you know, in Florida, and he gave the blanket immunity to every co-conspirator for Jeffrey Epstein. Yeah. And so everyone says, we can't charge anyone. And that's the issue we have, and that's where we have a problem. And I don't know the situation in the fix. I'm not a lawyer, but that's where this problem started, to where we can't get justice in this case.
But as a general matter, like forget
agency.
The specifics of Epstein, okay? Forget all the specifics. Does it track to you? Does it sound parsimonious to you that a guy in his position would be used as a vehicle to blackmail powerful figures in order to get concessions out of them for certain political interests? In other words, is there some coordinated like thing out there where very powerful people might be under the thumb of intelligence agencies that operate in this way, whether it's us, Mossad, China, whoever? Does that sound like something that could exist?
Well, that of course exists, and China is a very great example. China has a ton of blackmail, right? Like, you make yourself blackmailable, it's going to happen. My opinion is all these people that were friends with Jeffrey Epstein and did all these bad things are still doing them. So I'm not sure he had this huge blackmail material, because these are bad people. They do horrible things. They do horrible things to children. They're still doing horrible things to children. So I don't actually think it was a giant blackmail operation. I think he was a pervert. His friends were perverts, and they took advantage of a situation they were in, and they were able to because they were wealthy.
All right, Sarah Adams, thanks for your time, and stay safe.
Really appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.